Welcome back to Console Gaming History, where I do my very best to bring you the most accurate information about the history of console gaming. I've spent countless hours of research to cover things that usually get overlooked. In episode 1, we started with the early life of Ralph Baer, the genius behind the Magnavox Odyssey and the father of console gaming. We followed his journey from escaping Nazi Germany in the early 1930s to his initial idea for home video games in 1951 to the eventual release of the Magnavox Odyssey in 1972. In this episode, we'll pick up where we left off with the launch of the Odyssey and the events that eventually led to the first ever ROM-based video game cartridge. There is some debate over who deserves credit for this innovation, so I've dug deep to uncover the truth.
Magnavox presents Odyssey, the electronic game of the future.
With the Odyssey finally hitting store shelves, Magnavox had a huge task ahead of them. It was time to help consumers understand this new technology. Whether or not the term video game was a part of mainstream culture by 1972 is honestly up for debate. In an interview from December of 2007, Nolan Bushnell claims that it was coined in 1971 by a reporter who was at a trade show and stopped to check out Bushnell's first game, Computer Space. He said he thinks the reporter came from a magazine called Vending Times. This was investigated by Keith Smith in a blog called The Golden Age Arcade Historian. The post was titled The Etymology of Video Game. Keith reports an editor named Tim Ferrante volunteered to head to Vending Times New York's office to dig into their archives on a hunt for the truth. Turns out, this article does not include the term video game anywhere. Now, it's still possible this unknown reporter used the phrase at that time, and Nolan adopted the phrase, because the first documented case of the term being used was by Bushnell, and it was in a letter sent to John Britz at Bally's. That letter is dated July 10th, 1972. Unfortunately, we can't know for certain unless some new information happens to surface, but if it was already a coined phrase, it was not widely used yet, and wouldn't become more popular until 1973. When Atari used the term to promote their game Space Race. Instead, clunky phrases like the new electronic game of the future and closed circuit electronic playground were used, which almost created more questions than answers as they weren't particularly clear. Magnavox figured it might be easier to show people how the console worked. So, the Odyssey appeared on the popular game show What's My Line?
You must figure out what it is that we're doing. We will now show the audience what it is that we are doing.
This was a show where panelists would ask questions in order to guess a person's occupation. But in this episode, they had to guess what they were doing.
Am I standing on my head at any period?
No, you're not. Is it a cartoon figure and when I talk, the mouth moves? No, it is no offense to nature. We are playing tennis.
Oh, would you please?
Initially, Magnavox ordered 50,000 consoles. But after receiving positive market feedback, they upped their production and eventually manufactured somewhere between 120 and 150,000 units in 1972. The exact numbers are unclear, either due to poor record keeping or documents being lost to time. Either way, Magnavox was prepared to capitalize on the Odyssey's groundbreaking status as the first ever home game console. But they may have shot themselves in the foot. The Odyssey was to be sold exclusively in Magnavox dealers.
And where can you get it?
Exclusively at the Magnavox outlets.
Which meant if you wanted one, you had to live near a Magnavox dealer. It was also rumored that salespeople led customers to believe the console would only work on Magnavox television sets. Though it's just as likely that consumers made this assumption due to the exclusivity of the console. All of this combined with the high price of $99.95 likely contributed to lower than anticipated sales. Of the 120 to 150,000 produced, it's estimated only 69,000 of them sold in 1972. Ralph was frustrated. His hopes to sell the console for $25 were crushed by the excessive cost to produce the Odyssey. While doubts swirled at Magnavox around their future in the newly budding video game industry, Ralph was focusing his efforts on ways to improve the console. See, the Odyssey was not capable of producing audio, so one of his improvements was an attachable accessory that would add sound to games. And it was even backwards compatible with every game available. He also created games that housed new technology that would allow games to be more complex. According to Ralph, these were early ROM-type cartridges. While they didn't yet incorporate ROM chips, Ralph claims they achieved the same results. Unfortunately, Magnavox didn't see the vision and passed on both ideas. By 1973, Ralph pivoted to the idea of creating consoles with integrated circuitry. This would remove the need for circuit boards to be inserted to change games, but would also limit the ability to add games after release. Around this same time, another company was looking to do the same. During this time, the Odyssey was also being sold in Europe, and the technology was being copied by other companies. And some companies were not even trying to hide it. One of those consoles was the Overcall, which released in Spain in 1973. It's almost an exact replica. They legit just removed the need for circuit boards. 1973 is also when the Odyssey saw its first price reduction. This $20 drop to $79.95 helped Magnavox sell through their initial and second production runs. The console launched with 12 games, which were all playable by using the 6 provided circuit cards and accessories. Magnavox also went on to release additional games. The majority of them were essentially just board games with the board being displayed on the TV.
Each of the games, as the tennis game that you see on the TV, require a Mylar overlay like these. This one is the Haunted House overlay, a Simon Says overlay, which is in the educational area for the preschoolers. In addition, for each of the games, you're required game boards, decks of cards that you see here for Simon Says, Haunted House, the States game, chips for the roulette game.
To drive that idea home, many of the sold separate games technically came with the console, but you had to purchase accessories separately to be able to play them. But at $5.95 a pop, that could add up really quickly. Alternatively, you could purchase a bundle of 6 games for $24.95. There was also a light gun that was sold separate. It came bundled with 2 carts and additional accessories for a total of 4 more games. This bundle also retailed at $24.95. To create the prototype rifle, the team modified a Mark's Winchester Ricochet toy rifle. When it came time to mass produce the peripheral, Magnavox had to find a company that was capable of manufacturing them. Unfortunately, they couldn't work with Mark's because they would only be able to supply the rifles without the electronics. So Magnavox looked outside the US to a company that was already selling light guns. The Japan-based company had been selling light gun toys since 1970, and you may have heard of them. Magnavox signed a deal to work with Nintendo. Nintendo would manufacture their light guns, and in turn, Magnavox gave Nintendo exclusive rights to distribute Odyssey in Japan. It's possible this was the moment Nintendo knew that video games were the future. In an attempt to gather as much feedback from consumers as possible, the Odyssey console came with a mail-in survey card. Completing this and mailing it to Magnavox would award you with an exclusive game that was not available to purchase. There's a really well-done video that covers every game released for the Odyssey in depth. It's by a creator who goes by FrameRaider. I put the link in the description, so when you get to the end of this video, go check it out. After the Odyssey launched, Ralph was still playing with the idea of broadcasting games over cable television. His idea was for these games to be played live using the Odyssey console. Ralph presented this idea to multiple companies and eventually got one to agree to do a trial run. Bill Harrison and Ralph modified the existing Odyssey console and provided Warner with a spot generator that would be run at the cable station. Using this, Warner could generate spots that would move on their own, and players would be able to play against them through their cable feed. The team was able to prove the concept worked, but sadly, nothing came from this effort. By 1975, Magnavox teamed up with Texas Instruments, a semiconductor company from Dallas, Texas. They worked together to create the integrated circuitry consoles Ralph had started creating back in 1973. Unfortunately, Texas Instruments failed to get the chipsets to Magnavox in time, so they turned to National Semiconductor in Danbury, Connecticut for the new chips they required. But this also fell through. With two companies failing to come through, they had time to fully evaluate the situation and realized that using new chips would end up being too costly to actually make a profit. So they ended up falling back on some 10-year-old technology provided by Texas Instruments. These efforts eventually spawned the Magnavox Odyssey 100 and 200. This was a turning point for the company, and by the fall of 1975, the Magnavox Odyssey was discontinued. The company continued creating a variety of integrated circuit consoles. One of those was the Magnavox Odyssey 4305, which was a television set with their tennis game built in. Eventually, the company did return to cartridge-based consoles, but that's a story for another time. Now let's rewind a bit to the late 1960s. A man named Norm Alpert was working for American Machine Foundry. The company was most well known for making equipment for bowling alleys. Alpert was working on automated scoring boards at the time, but the company was looking to move their R&D department from Stamford, Connecticut, down the coast to North Carolina. Not wanting to make that move, he and a few colleagues left AMF to start his own company, Alpex Computer Corporation. Initially, the company teamed up with Pitney Bowes. Together, they worked on electronic cash registers. Dealing with direct competition with IBM and NCR proved to be too much. The company was losing millions, so the partnership ended toward the tail end of 1973. It was at this time Alpex began to notice the excitement building around the newly forming video game industry.
It's going to be financially successful, as well as, I think, a very serious part in the leisure time activity of the American people.
And began thinking about creating their own game console. The technology landscape was rapidly changing. Magnavox's Odyssey was built on technology from the early 60s, but by 1971, companies were developing microprocessors. These chips were tiny and able to do the work of what used to take multiple circuit boards. Intel released their 4004 microprocessor in 1971, becoming the first to release a commercially available microprocessor. Just 3 years later, they almost doubled the power when they released the 8080. Other companies such as Fairchild, National Semiconductor, and RCA were also creating their own microprocessors to compete with Intel. But Intel remains king. When Alpert left AMF to form Alpex, one of the people who came with him was a man named Wallace Kirshner. Now that microprocessors were becoming easier to implement into new technology, Kirshner saw the potential in using them to create more complex video games. He brought this idea to Alpert, who gave him the go-ahead to start working on an early proof of concept. The two realized that if they wanted to be first to market, they were going to need some help. So they reached out to an engineer named Lawrence Haskell, who they had worked with during their days at AMF and Pitney Bowes Alpex. I don't know if it's just me, but Lawrence reminds me a lot of Peppermint Larry from Flapjack.
Don't want to work, huh? We'll see about that.
With Kirshner developing the hardware and Haskell working on software, the team at Alpex started creating what would eventually become the first video game console to use ROM-based cartridges for storing their games, which would allow consumers to swap games quickly by simply plugging in a new cartridge. This early concept was codenamed Raven, which stands for Remote Access Video Entertainment, and underneath the hood, it housed two Intel 8008 chips combined with an 8-bit CPU. Leveraging a whopping 8 kilobits of RAM, the system could generate a 128 by 64 black and white display by storing the bitmap in memory. The team was constrained by high costs of memory modules. This forced them to limit each game to being only 2 kilobytes or less. Their first game, Hockey, expanded on the ping-pong style gameplay that was popular at the time. Their version had on-screen scoring and a game clock. Players could rotate the player paddles in order to angle their shots, and each player even had their own controllable goalie. Next, they created tic-tac-toe, shooting gallery, and doodle. But the real challenge was figuring out how users would be able to swap games easily, and more importantly, safely. They needed ROM-based cartridges. ROM-based cartridges weren't an entirely new idea. In fact, the first ROM-based cartridge wasn't even created for video games. In 1969, IBM was working on creating a new type of ROM chip, and their document detailing their efforts fell into the hands of two engineers at Hewlett-Packard, Larry Lopp and Virgil Lang. It's not known for sure, but some speculate the document was given to them by Dave Maitland, due to Dave's research work on IC fabrication for the company. Reading over the brief, they realized they could make this idea a reality. HP already had experience creating PMOS ROM boards, but that technology was nearing its limits. Armed with the IBM document, they began working on creating the newer NMOS ROMs. I started looking into the difference in chip styles, and explaining the details of how this is an enhancement is pretty dense. So just trust me, it was an upgrade. Moving on, HP did more than just figure it out. By 1971, they had released the HP 9820A desktop calculator. Consumers could purchase expansion modules in the form of insertable ROM cartridges. This allowed them to add different functions to their calculator based on their specific needs. No games were ever developed for the calculator, so many feel that its existence played zero role in the eventual debut of ROM carts for video games. When asked if they knew about these cartridges before they began development, the folks at both Alpex and Fairchild denied having any knowledge of the technology. So I'll avoid any speculation around this because the truth is, we just don't know. What we do know is that Kirshner decided the team needed to create an easy and consumer-safe way to be able to swap games. First, the team mounted the fragile ROM chips to more sturdy circuit boards, then encased them in black plastic boxes to make them easier to hold and keep the electronics safe inside. With a working prototype in hand, Kirshner and Haskell met with Norm Alpert and the board of directors at Alpex. Collectively, the group wanted to proceed with the idea, but recognized to do so would require them to team up with a much larger company. So in early 1975, they began meeting with television companies. The group met with Sylvania, Zenith, Motorola, and even RCA. Yeah, the same company that Magnavox backed out of a partnership while shopping around the Odyssey. All the companies signed NDAs, but all the companies decided to pass on the collaboration. With this, Alpex and team turned to semiconductor manufacturers. One of those companies was Fairchild. Back when Alpex was working on early point-of-sales terminals, a rep from Fairchild named Sean Fogarty would supply the team at Alpex with parts. So they already had a working relationship. But this time, they were hoping for a partnership. So in early 1975, Alpex called up Fogarty and lured him to the office with a vague request for him to come and check out what they've been working on. Intrigued, Fogarty took the invitation, and after seeing the Raven prototype, he returned to Fairchild and presented the details to their Vice President of Consumer Products, Greg Reyes. Reyes was also impressed, so he went directly to Fairchild's CEO, Wilf Corrigan. Corrigan also saw the potential, so he pulled Gene Landrum onto the team, as well as another engineer named Jerry Lawson. Lawson was known for having an early passion for video games. In 1973, he used the Fairchild F8 microprocessor to create an arcade game called Demolition Derby, and he did it in his garage. The team of two were tasked with flying from California to Connecticut to check out the Raven console, and to help Corrigan decide if it was worth purchasing. Spoiler alert, it was worth it. Lawson returned and told the folks at Fairchild, hey, the prototype looks like it's going to be worth something. But before Fairchild was willing to license the console, they had to know it could be converted from using the Intel chip to using their own F8 microprocessor. Since Jerry already had some experience using the F8 for video games, he was put in charge of the conversion, but worked closely with the original creators Kirshner and Haskell. With the console converted, Gene and Jerry worked together and created a business plan, which they delivered to Greg Reyes on November 26, 1975. It was titled Business Opportunity Analysis, Alpex Video Game. This document included a code name for the console, Stratos, as well as concept sketches for a new controller. The Raven prototype operated using a keyboard, but the team wanted to create something that could be easily held and able to perform many complex inputs. So Jerry and a designer named Nicholas Telesford worked together and designed one of the most unique controllers I've ever seen. But that design had to become a reality. And to make that happen, a mechanical engineer named Ron Smith teamed up with Rich Rhodes. Together, they took the schematics laid out by Lawson and the visual designs from Telesford and got to work. The top of the controller could be moved in 8 directions. Players could also twist it left and right and even push it down or pull it up. It was basically the first Bop It.
Bop it. Twist it. Pull it.
This was easily the most revolutionary controller to date, but unfortunately, they had to wire it to the console to save money. Next, it was time to convert the Intel 8080 prototype games to work with the Fairchild F8 microprocessor, which meant Haskell had to completely rewrite his early games. One of those games was Hockey, which ended up being built directly into the console along with their version of tennis. The console was coming along nicely and the team was making incredible progress, but they still hadn't created cartridges. To take on that challenge, the team of 3 consisted of Ron Smith, Nick Telesford, and Jerry Lawson. Their goal was to take the ROM cartridge Wallace Kirshner and Lawrence Haskell had created and turn it into something ready for consumers. The prototype carts had ROM chips mounted onto a circuit board. These boards were placed into a small plastic case that allowed the 25-pin connectors to stick out of the bottom. While they were fine for testing, the boards were way too flimsy and the pins were too small, so they really wouldn't hold up long term. The new carts had to withstand the chaos that humans might inflict on them. Looking for solutions, Telesford turned to the popular music recording format of the 8-track tape. These were built to not only withstand rough use, but they were built to be tossed around the insides of cars, which honestly made them the perfect inspiration for the new cartridges. Adding some textures to the edges for grip and landing on the color yellow so they'd stand out, Telesford then hired a man named Tom Kamafuji to design the labels. And Tom did more than just design the labels. Tom set the precedent for cartridge and box illustrations by creating bright designs that didn't replicate what was in the game. But instead, he decided to create things that would catch people's eye and draw them in. So we can thank Tom for all those times we picked up a game at Toys R Us because of the cover. Whether or not your decision worked out, that's a whole nother problem. I tried to dig more into Tom's work, but honestly, I really couldn't find much. He's kind of a ghost. Probably the most noteworthy achievement is that Tom is the person who added the rainbow color scheme to the Apple logo. He made this design decision when he was asked to create some posters for the company. The Fairchild carts were numbered and each contained multiple games. They were designed with a small plastic door that covered the exposed connectors to keep it safe. When the cartridge is inserted into the console, the door would flip open, allowing the cart to be fully inserted. It would then lock into place and could only be removed by using the eject button. One of the team members eventually went on to make cartridges for another company. But again, that's something we'll get into in a future episode. While the cartridge was being finalized, the team was also refactoring the console to have a smaller form factor and more appealing aesthetics, which still ended up looking an awful lot like an 8-track player. Either way, the team had done it. The console was complete and they called it the Fairchild Video Entertainment System. But they ended up changing the name the very next year. The console made its initial debut on June 14th at the Summer Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago. For some reason, the company decided to show up with a non-working version of the console. It's possible it wasn't quite ready yet, so they probably missed out on some solid early traction. It wasn't until July 8th, 1976, when the console was covered in Business Week, that they started to build hype. The article gave the console high praise, but it also tipped off their competitors at RCA and Atari, which lit a fire under them to speed up production on their own consoles. In late October of 1976, the team was given the okay to prepare to release the console to the wild, and the Fairchild Video Entertainment System released in November of 1976, just in time for the holidays, and with a price tag of $169.95. 2 games were built directly into the system. Those were hockey and tennis, and 3 carts could be purchased separately. Video Cart 1, which had tic-tac-toe, shooting gallery, doodle, and quadradoodle. Video Cart 2 had Desert Fox and shooting gallery. And Video Cart 3 was just video blackjack. Fairchild had done it. The team officially became the first to release a ROM-based cartridge console. But soon, other companies would join them, sparking the first truly competitive market in video games. In fact, another company entered the market just months after the Fairchild released, and it's probably not who you think. As for who actually deserves credit for the creation of the cartridge, there's really not a single person responsible. There were tons of teams of people working on it to get this thing done. Jerry often gets the credit, and I get it. He was an integral part of the team that helped turn the early prototypes into consumer-grade products. Without Jerry, the Fairchild may not have been the first console to introduce not only ROM carts to the market, but also the pause function. Yeah, Jerry is the genius that decided you might have to pee or something in the middle of a game. I should be able to pause this. Thank you, Jerry. In episode 3, we'll cover the story of the RCA Studio II, the second to market ROM-based console, and we'll continue following Fairchild's post-launch journey. Thank you for checking out Console Gaming History Episode 2.